Welcome to the 6th edition of the Wage Roundtable series, Indigenous Self-Determination, Legal Pluralism, and Inequalities in the Arctic. We are pleased to have Laura Wilmot as our facilitator today. We'd like to thank you for joining us as presenters or as guests, and we were pleased to have the opportunity to have these discussions with you all. I would also like to thank Sophie Thériault and Gail Fondo, who also helped organize this event, and I will now give the floor to Laura.
Thank you, Karen. Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue. Merci de vous joindre à nous, peu importe où vous vous trouvez en ce moment. Comme l'a mentionné Karen, je serai la facilitatrice de ce panel. Je m'appelle Laura Wilmot et je suis étudiante au doctorat en droit. J'ai la chance de faire partie justement du partenariat Wage en tant qu'étudiante qui organise ce panel sur l'autodétermination autochtone, le pluralisme juridique et les inégalités dans l'Arctique. Avant de se lancer dans les questions du panel, laissez-moi d'abord vous présenter les 4 panélistes que nous avons la chance d'avoir avec nous. Let me first introduce you Bridget Larocque, who is a policy advisor and researcher with the Arctic Athabascan Council. Thank you, Bridget, for being with us. And then we have Anders Oskal, who is Secretary General for the Association of World Reindeer Herders. Thank you, Anders, for joining us. Et nous avons également Lisa Ellington, qui est professeure à la Faculté des sciences sociales de l'École de travail social et de criminologie de l'Université Laval. Puis, finalement, Sophie Thériault, qui est professeure à la Faculté de droit dans la section de droit civil de l'Université d'Ottawa. This panel will be a roundtable of 4 questions. Each participant will answer each question, then we will follow with an exchange with the audience. Our first question is, can you briefly talk about your research and or your practice and explain how issues of Indigenous peoples' self-determination and equality manifest in your work? We will start the first question with Bridget, and you have around 3 minutes to answer. So the floor is yours, Bridget.
Good morning, and thank you for the invite. Yeah, 2 minutes is a short time, but I'll try my best. The thing for our research is to ensure that our Indigenous perspectives in all areas of concern are incorporated alongside our scientific research, but not only from a co-management, but from a really equal-based perspective, if not dominant, because we want to ensure that it's our voices, our experiences, and our lifeways that are respected and shared. So our own methodologies, our own wisdom has to be front and center of the research we continue to do. So it's still a challenge, but I think there are a lot of gains we're making in academia. But like I said, we're still up against a lot of challenges. But hopefully, with more and more allies, we can become more influencers than being influenced by the main civil society.
Thank you for breaking the ice, and I really love that, being more influencers than influence. I'd like to turn now to Anders. You have as well around 3 minutes to answer.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I see a number of known people in the audience and panel, so that's very nice to see you all. Yes, well, I work with and for World Reindeer Herders, which is the civil society organization for all the 24 nomadic Indigenous peoples that base our lives on following the reindeer. The reindeer is of course everything to our peoples, as we depend on them in every conceivable way. Now, seeing as how our constituency are spread across the Arctic, Needless to say, there are different governance systems and so on that have been, how to say, brought upon our land in what we like to refer to as modern times. In our work, we do focus on the large challenges, the sort of super tankers of our time, meaning climate change, land use change in particular, and how those two are intertwined. Globalization, if you will, are coming on top of every other challenge that our nomadic indigenous peoples and societies, communities are facing already. So it is really a challenging situation in terms of our own capacity to respond, not only to respond to all the negatives of Arctic change, but also the possibility, perhaps even to dream of, responding in terms of utilizing a few of the opportunities that do arise from all of these changes. We know some things about the areas in which we have lived. A main challenge for us is that still today we see that the knowledge system of reindeerhood is not always respected. It's not understood, but it's not respected, meaning that it's not taken into account either when it comes to governance decisions in the Arctic. And that means that insofar as our knowledge is not included, it means that however you look at it, if you look at it from mainstream society even, we are losing out on the best available knowledge. Because let's face it, the horizon we have in front of us, the challenges we see already are of such proportions that we need to use the best available knowledge. And that often is not happening today. I would therefore like to say that I'm very happy. I would like to thank the organizers and Gerard and Marilyn and their team for putting this on the agenda. I'm very happy about that. So thank you. Ologito.
Thank you very much, Anders. Je laisserai maintenant la parole à Lisa.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde. So I'll be speaking in English because I can speak more briefly. You know, in English it's always faster. So thanks for the organizers. I'm really happy to be around the table this afternoon or evening for some of you. So I work with First Nations and Inuit communities in Quebec for the past 15 years in different projects around Indigenous governance of child welfare services. I work right now with the Atikamekw community of Abidjan, as many of you know, which is a fantastic community, but also very geographically isolated. And I worked more recently with Nunavimut, so the Inuit of Nunavik, 14 communities along the coast of Hudson Bay and Ungava Bay. And I'm working with Inuit-based organizations such as Nunavimi, Illagi, Papatovinia, and Makivik, both having the goal of offering culturally safe services for Inuit children and their families. And just for briefly a little context of my work, because of the failure of provincial youth protection systems to protect Indigenous children, Canada adopted a federal child protection law for Indigenous children in 2019. And this law recognizes and affirms Indigenous peoples' inherent right to self-government over child and family services, including the right to have their own child welfare law. And it also establishes national standards related to the best interest of Indigenous children, including their right to cultural continuity and respect of Indigenous traditions and customs. So in my work with Abidjan, I'm documenting with them the implementation of their own child and family services law, which is the first Indigenous law in child welfare in Quebec. While with the Nunavimut, we are exploring right now the possibility of having GLADU type reports in youth protection. So reports that they exist in the criminal justice system, and we are thinking about maybe it could be useful in youth protection to provide a historical and cultural perspective to understand the difficulties faced by families. And how can we make more culturally safe decisions? So in a nutshell, I'm doing my best to support Indigenous self-determination because I strongly believe that it's one of the best ways to reduce inequalities.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your answer. And I'll let Sophie now close the first question.
Alors, bonjour à toutes et tous. Je suis ravie d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup pour votre participation. Je vais aussi parler en anglais aujourd'hui parce que j'ai fait la plupart de mes travaux dans cette langue sur les sujets sur lesquels on va aborder. Donc, je vais parler en anglais. So, my research focuses on Indigenous people's rights in the context of natural resource extraction, as well as on Indigenous territorial and environmental governance and justice. It examines the various ways and often insidious ways in which state law dispossesses and marginalizes Indigenous peoples in decision-making processes regarding land use and extraction, and the role of law in creating, reproducing, and potentially remediating environmental injustices for Indigenous peoples. So my most recent research work looks at Indigenous peoples' rights and jurisdiction, especially in the context of mining. So some of this recent work I've been conducting with my PhD student, Zoé Boirin-Fargue, who is also a researcher within the Wage Network, as I've compared Canada and Finno-Canadian countries' laws at the intersection of mining legal frameworks and Indigenous people's rights. And we found through that work that overall, those countries' legal systems tend to prioritize mining development over Indigenous people's land use. We found that when Indigenous people's rights are recognized, they tend to take the form of more or less intensive participatory rights, generally falling short of the UNDRIP norm of free, prior, and informed consent. In other works that I conducted with PhD student Sabrina Bourgeois from Laval University and with also Zoé Boirin-Fargue, research based in Matsumekosh, Lake John, or in the Shefferville region. I'm speaking too fast. That's a curse I have. So I'll try to slow down. So in more recent work conducted in Matsumekosh, Lake John, or in the Shefferville region of northern Quebec, we found that Indigenous peoples faced with the Tata Steel mining projects were exercising their agency using a vast repertoire of strategies, including legal actions, including negotiations, including protests and resistance. And while they were able to influence mining to a certain level, their agency remained heavily constrained by structural factors that are shaping power relationships between mining companies and Indigenous peoples, including mining legal frameworks that tend to favor mining over Indigenous peoples' land use. And finally, other aspects of my research and teachings that are relevant to the subject we're discussing today is the work I've been conducting on Indigenous peoples' legal orders and their interactions with the state legal system, with a particular focus on land resources and territories. So in the past few years, I've had the chance to teach a field course in Innu law that is offered in Washat Maliotenam, an Innu community located on the northern coast of Quebec, during which elders and other community knowledge holders are sharing with the students Innu law related to different topics, including family law, and including the relationship to land and resources. But I've also been sharing their everyday struggles in their relationship with state law and authorities. So I can say that self-determination is permeating my research work and my teaching on all aspects. Thank you.
based on your research and/or practice again, what are the main issues and challenges that are related to the recognition and protection of Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination? And this time I would like to let Anders answer first.
Well, yes, thank you. Before I say anything, I should note that I am not a lawyer. I am a reindeer herder, but these days reindeer herders do seem to have a lot of practice in law from the courts. So we have, it seems, all families in the village where I'm living have been to the Supreme Court as of late. Well, challenges. Of course, the backdrop for the practice, or let's say lack of practice of our rights, is also that of narratives. We hear a lot of narratives these days about how the Arctic, our homelands, is sort of a room for all. And there is room for everything because the territory is so vast and it's desolate and hardly any people live there, etc., etc. So it means there's room for mining, there's room for windmill development, hydroelectrical power dams, biofuel, tourism, leisure activities, which, by the way, plays into what's in Norwegian and Swedish is called allemansretten, the right of everybody, which is also a problematic thing. Now, and then this is sort of mixed into narratives, discourses around the needs of society. Now, if we are to talk about rights, rights does not have anything to do with majority decisions. Rights we have. So that is not the question. The question is, of course, whether or not those rights are respected. And we were on our lands long before the national states, the concept of national states was even invented, certainly any Westphalian versions of it. In the Nordic countries, we could say quite clearly that any progress made on recognition and respect of our rights have come through case law, not through the decisions of lawmakers. And there is an over-representation of reindeer herders in the courts. That in itself should be interesting to more people than just reindeer herders, but it seems it is, The Lawyers Association in Norway, I believe the same in other Nordic countries, are very interested in these things, but still. Of course, we have some differences when we look at the whole area. The Russia, China, Mongolia, for reindeer herds, there is different than from the Nordics, that is different from North America, and such and such. There is an interesting distinction, though, as it relates to Roman law, the Roman law tradition. Now, in Russia, either you own land, meaning that then you have rights. If you don't own land, you have no rights. In the Nordics, we have gotten, again, through case law, the principle, the notion that we can have rights without owning the land, user rights. It is not so simple. And of course, when you think about this, reindeer herders, we don't really have an understanding that you can own land, because where would you get it from initially? From God? Well, that's also a story we have heard, right? So by that, what I'm saying is that the courts are not our courts, and that in itself should be a problem. There are no Sami representation in the courts, save perhaps the one court that is made in the northernmost part of Norway, on the lower level court. So that is a bit of the challenge here. And as you are mentioning different things, of course, what comes to mind is some decisions from the courts as of late. The Fosen verdict of the Norwegian Supreme Court, of course, being quite a hot topic. It was, for those who don't know the case, it was two basically extended families of reindeer herders that went up against a windmill developer and won in the Supreme Court. basically based on the Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the most central human rights instrument. That case was pretty interesting also in that it was given a so-called advanced possession, meaning that the developer built the windmills while the case was tested in court. And then once the Supreme Court Grand Chamber ruled unanimously in favor of reindeer herders, there were now suddenly, let's put it like this, a billion reasons, literally speaking. That was the price tag for the development of those windmills. A billion reasons not to take them down, which was, of course, what the reindeer herders wanted. Later on, there was a negotiation agreement, but I think this case is quite interesting, not least due to the fact that now the case was barely settled by negotiation post the Supreme Court verdict. Now there are plans to build more windmills affecting the same reindeer herders in the same area. So you can understand that this is not going to go away anytime soon. And here it is tempting to say that in terms of law, the structures, systems for impact assessments, at least in Fennoscandia, is really not well developed. Because the case in Norway, for instance, is that it doesn't even say what kind of impact assessment you're supposed to have. So what is it? Is it an ecological impact assessment? Is it a social impact assessment? Is it resilience analysis? What? And unfortunately, you get a lot of things for money these days. And you have, in lack of better words, those who are academic mercenaries. Some of the companies doing impact assessments, we've found, take 80% of their income from one and the same developer, meaning they're not independent. So this is a bit of a challenge. I've heard that in Canada, there are different structures in place in some of the indigenous areas in terms of having a mechanism that the developers have to pay for impact assessments, but they do not get to choose them, and they do not unanimously or by themselves, define the mandate for any particular impact assessment. And certainly, and then I haven't even mentioned how typically our knowledge system is completely overlooked in such impact assessments, meaning, again, that the real impacts are not known before decisions are made. So that's a part of what we are looking at over here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anders, for sharing this. I will now leave the floor to Bridget.
Yeah, thank you, Anders, for that. And of course, we're not far behind you, regardless of the I guess an image or impression people have of Canada and respect or reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples. So we all know that the systems are flawed. Of course, Indigenous laws, governance, and values are not respected. There's a big push on for extracting critical minerals from the 3 territories, and that that's the way to go because of the global demand, or to elevate Canada's image as a global producer. But the problem is that we'd be having huge concerns with land use, with water use, and where's the benefit for the Indigenous peoples? So those are still huge issues in this co-management narrative, because once again, that's still a bureaucratic colonial system. So we're still having to operate, regardless that you have historic number treaties, regardless that you have modern day treaties, regardless that you have self-government agreements. These are all only treaty rights from what the state has given you. Whatever the Indigenous peoples want, then it has to be negotiated. So the way they want to, and I think Lisa alluded to this, the Child Welfare Act. Well, is that the words Indigenous peoples would have used? Now we have concerns with, all of the social disparities, but we're really not having conversations with the people in community that are most impacted. And whenever we're talking to leadership, we know a lot of them, or title holders, are receiving payoffs from industry and from industry and organizations that want access to the territories. We also know that we're often ignored and erased or marginalized because of state interest. And if they have the national interest component to an issue, then they have full authority to do as they please on the lands that Indigenous peoples occupy. So, even UNDRIP is weak in the fact that it has limited sanctions, influence on individual states. We also know we have huge issues with free, prior, informed consent, and we have huge issues with Big C consultation. So those are issues that then impact our community ways of knowing, doing, and being, our community life ways. Gender is looked at from the male-female sex, not from a holistic perspective and an Indigenous perspective. So, it goes on and on and on. So, our capacity is limited. The 3 territories are just over 100 and some thousand, huge population increase in Whitehorse and Iqaluit. We're kind of standardized, or what's the other word? We're kind of, I'll just say standardized right now for Yellowknife with respect to population, but in a way that's good because we're also dealing with values wars and value conflicts because we're having immigration and there's really no cultural competency building, and we're also having huge subsidies for immigrants, but there again, we're not even respected for affirmative action. So you won't see a lot of our people in the industry, but we'll see a lot of immigrants. So, we're having all of these impacts constantly impacting, affecting our capacity building. And if we're just erased or ignored, then these social disparities will never go away. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bridget, for highlighting all those important issues. Sophie, do you want to follow on that?
Sure, and it will echo a lot of what Bridget said. Thank you, Bridget. So from the perspective of my research, one of the main issue of self-determination when we think about extraction and land uses is the lack of control and authority by Indigenous peoples on extractive projects that are taking place on their traditional lands and that are affecting their environments, culture, health, as well as the right as those projects are often, in fact, imposed on the lands and on communities, despite all colonial processes of consultation and participation that have been put in place in the past decades. So my research, or the recent research I conducted on mining in particular, show that Indigenous peoples do participate, although to varying degrees depending on the regions, in decision-making processes affecting their traditional territories. And it also shows that they might influence to a certain extent the parameters of projects that are implemented on their land. However, from this research, we also observe that Indigenous peoples have very limited power to determine whether these projects should or not occur on their land in the first place, at least without getting into very costly contestation and resistance. So the lack of recognition of self-determination and the lack of recognition of Indigenous jurisdiction over their traditional lands led projects to be imposed on their communities, and we observed the same with Zoébois and Fargue in Finno-Skinnian countries, with little space to say no and to have this no respected by state authorities that often assume the possible coexistence of mining and Indigenous peoples' right through mitigation measure, which is heavily contested by communities that are impacted by mining. So to be sure, land claims agreements and self-government agreements, and Bridget referred to them, did increase Indigenous people's say in decision-making processes regarding their land. We can think of co-management board and environmental assessment boards, but these, as Bridget mentioned, are colonial institutions. And while Indigenous peoples may have a say, the state is jealously retaining the last word or the final authority over decision-making on Indigenous peoples' lands, which is highly problematic from a self-determination perspective. Where Indigenous peoples do not have land claims agreements in the Canadian context, there is no the colonial institution or process that will apply for Indigenous peoples to participate in decision-making process is the weak duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples that has proven very problematic, and that falls short and really short from enabling the exercise by Indigenous people of the right to free, prior, and informed consent, and fall short from the capacity of Indigenous people to exercise their jurisdictions over their traditional lands according to their own legal orders, their own priorities, and their own perspectives. And worse, I should talk about the practice in the past 2 decades where people have been negotiating or contracting their participation in mining decision processes through contracts that we name in Canada impact and benefits agreements, or IBAs. This practice is now common and widespread in the Canadian context as well as in Australia, and we hear, and Anders could or not confirm it, but that it's starting to take hold, or at least to be discussed also in the Finno-Skinnian context. It's those private negotiations between mining proponents and affected Indigenous communities where compensations are negotiated and some mitigation measure for the projects, but also some benefits related, for instance, to employments, contracting, and so on. So while some researchers have argued that IBAs may contribute to a certain extent to self-determination by providing revenues, for instance, for self-government or community-based initiatives, many more researchers have argued that IBAs are in fact ill-suited for the exercise of self-determination and of free, prior, and informed consent, emphasizing the balance, the imbalance of power between mining companies and Indigenous peoples, but also the tight schedule for their negotiation, the confidentiality of these agreements that are not really enabling the deliberative processes and discussions and transparent discussions that could otherwise take place within Indigenous communities according to their own laws and processes. So all these, especially in the context of intensifying mining and extractive activities on Indigenous land, Bridget mentioned critical minerals like that are more and more sought for in the context of the energy transition. So all of these issues of lack of control and lack of effective jurisdiction by Indigenous peoples on their traditional lands will prove increasingly problematic from a self-determination perspective.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Maybe we'll let Anders get back on the IBA's question during the next question. So Lisa could close our second question.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura. Well, thanks to Anders, Bridget, and Sophie. I think you already addressed important issues around inherent rights that are not respected despite court rulings. The fact court rulings are not necessarily within Indigenous traditions, the fact that systems are flawed, consultations are flawed or non-existent. So there are already many issues that have been said around self-determination and child welfare services. If I dig more specifically, I think the issues are similar. Like in my research with Obidjwan and the Nunavimut in Nunavik, well, I can see many issues, but I think one of those that have affected all Indigenous communities in Quebec and in Canada is Quebec's refusal to acknowledge the inherent right of Indigenous self-determination in the governance of child protection services. And Quebec went as far as to challenge the federal law I was speaking earlier in the Supreme Court, arguing that Indigenous rights to self-government cannot be unilaterally affirmed by legislation, and that the federal law is unconstitutional as it interferes with provincial powers. So that was Quebec's arguments. And Quebec asserted that self-determination must be proven in court or negotiated with the provinces and the federal government. So this refusal or denial of the inherent right for 4 years, so between the federal law was adopted in 2019 and the decision of the Supreme Court was in 2024. So it took a long time. And of course, I think it undermined Indigenous communities' efforts to assert jurisdiction over child welfare services and develop Indigenous-led laws. And it's probably one of the reasons why we only have one community in Quebec that has its own child welfare law up to now, because of Quebec's denial of this inherent right. And during all this time, children's rights are also infringed all the time, and they are not necessarily respected. So this is one of the main issues, I think, related to child welfare. Another one is the, I would say, pervasive lack of trust from the Quebec government towards Indigenous communities' ability to take responsibility for child welfare services. And this is, I would call it paternalistic attitude that is often we see manifestations of that in skepticism about whether Inuit or First Nations community are truly capable of taking over services or ensuring the safety of their children. And this view, I think it fuels tensions and slow down negotiations as well, because it makes it harder for Indigenous communities to take gradually control over services and create services agreements because of this lack of trust. And of course, there's also a lack of funding, I think, towards self-determination and governance initiatives. It's another huge issue. I think that developing Inuit and First Nation laws and youth protection systems requires long-term human and financial resources. And actually, prevention protection services are overly underfunded in First Nations and Inuit communities. And in Canada, we have history of provincial and federal governments disagreeing on who is primarily responsible for funding such services, and the issue is still ongoing. And almost every program and service area related to Indigenous peoples has led to findings of human rights violations against state governments. And many public inquiries in Canada and in Quebec call this interjurisdictional neglect. and linked the lack of cooperation between governments, provincial and federal, as a key contributor to the poverty experienced by Indigenous peoples. So the federal child welfare law that we have now in Canada, it recognizes or reaffirms inherent rights, but it does not guarantee financial commitments for developing, resourcing, implementing Indigenous child welfare systems. So we are actually at a time where Canada recognizes the rights, but without ensuring the long-term funding agreements that it will follow and will be sufficient to answer children and families' needs. So a lot of issues to put in place or actualize the right to self-determination.
And linked to our last question, I'd like to hear you on the implications of the issues and challenges you have identified in relation to the realization of Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination for the reproduction or production of inequalities in the Arctic region. Bridget, do you want to open the floor?
Sure. I think one of our biggest challenges is that the fact Canada negotiates or consults with the 3 national organizations, all based in Ottawa, the Inuit, First Nations, and Métis organizations. So they're not really talking to the people and community, and they're not really hearing the impact and the concerns the people and community have. I don't think it's fair that you have people better educated, affluent, and mobile, and able to live in the big city of Ottawa, having the voice and ears of the current political leader. So we have a lot of issues with political will. It's clear that, lack of funding, and then also lack of recognition. There's Métis people that are in the Arctic that are not, their voices aren't heard, but here I am, one of them, speaking with you all today. From our own Indigenous groups in Canada, we also have issues of probably I'll just say racism. So and or fighting over the slim resources that Canada sends our way. So when you have this conflict, then you don't have security and community. And with issues of when we don't have direct involvement and engagement to talk about immigration, to talk about refugees, to talk about multiculturalism, then we're always we're always trying to find ways to solve the issues that are happening in community. We have huge homelessness issues. We have more violent drug attacks. We have, human trafficking. These things that we were, really never engaged in the past, because the language out there that we're remote, isolated, difficult to get to. We also have huge issues with security at the airports, transportation security, because our communities are small. The 3 capitals, if you're heading north, you don't have to go through security. So of course, then illegal substances and weapons and so forth end up in our communities. So those are the things that are the reality on the ground. Infrastructure is dated. The concept of the elimination of fossil fuels, when if you're in the north and in the Arctic, you're heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and when our water levels are low, when landslides happen, when our waterways are impacted, our entire way of life gets impacted. So now, because of low water levels, food is having to be trucked in instead of barged in, or it has to be flown in. So that's increasing the cost of living, and food prices are already extremely high in the Arctic. So, I think the true tale will be told in November when people are having to fill up their fuel tanks to heat their homes. So, and it's everything is circular and intersected. So, we can't just talk about one issue without feeling the impacts in other areas of our ways. So, I think there has to be a real rethink about, modern day land claims, self-government agreements, and the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights, because we're tired of being in the courts, and even now in the courts, against each other over what we determine to be proper respect, proper consultation. So I don't have an easy answer. I just want to leave a little story. When in the Yukon they were developing a developing industry, then there was this plant that was going to be set up, and there was a conversation with an elder, and he was brought back onto the land by his trap line and his cabin, and they were talking about a waste management facility of some sort, and when he was thinking about it, he started crying, because it was going to be, he wasn't sure how his land and cabin and trap line was going to be impacted. So those are the stories that people need to hear, regardless of them being in politics or industry or in co-management regimes, because it's really humanizing it, and it's bringing us all to the fact that we're all stewards of this land. It's just not Indigenous people's role. It's every one of us. And yes, we have more rights because this is our land base, and everything about us comes from our land. So I'll leave that with you all.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Anders, do you want to answer?
Well, first I would like to say I'm like to mirror what has been said by Bridget, Sophie, and Lisa as well. One quick comment on what Sophie mentioned on confidentiality agreements. Indeed, industry does have its way of playing their games, which has led us to try to remedy the capacity challenge of our communities and our youth by making some programs on diplomacy and negotiation. One of the components being the strategies and tactics of developers, seeing as how people don't have necessarily, aren't stupid, but don't have that experience, and we make the same better experiences over and over and over again. So we do that with Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, based on the Harvard program on negotiation methodology, supported, by the way, I should say, by Norway and Canada. One of the things we do is to also develop negotiation cases, not to say that it's right to negotiate under any circumstance, but if you are to negotiate, we'd like to train our youth in safe environments to become more skilled. Then to the point of agreements. Well, I think we must first and foremost recognize again the difference in institutional context. In Fennoscandia, it seems, for instance, that often any form of corporate social responsibility or any derivative thereof seems to be handled through the taxes paid. And that is, of course, not necessarily sufficient by any means, not least because you don't know where those taxes would end up. Chances are they will end up pretty far from those who are actually affected, those who are the rights holders. Now, mind you, Reindeerherd's rights are based on customary use in good faith since time immemorial. And there are cases where, speaking of industry, they made agreements with the neighbors of the affected rainforests. So the neighbors say, this is that develop. And there are too many flaws that just can easily be exploited like this. Another interesting fact is how it seems that so often the industry is pointing to the government, and the government is pointing to the industry to take responsibility. So who pulverizes the real responsibility? And just to elaborate a little bit more on a hot topic of today, namely energy, or the so-called green energy. Land-based windmills is a very hot topic just now. And the argument again goes that, oh, yes, we need energy. We really need green energy. Are you against the green energy transition? Well, then, you have to respect it. It's in your backyard. First of all, it's not our backyard. It's our cultural landscape. It is essential. Especially the areas where you put windmills, which is usually on the continent. Now, if it's true that we do need all of this green, so-called green energy, why does not governments instruct the industry to have a dialogue with the rights holders, reindeerherders, based on international law, based on free, prior, and informed consent? Because they don't. And what is the result? Well, the industry oftentimes is acting as if we are simply not there. We are not there. And this, my argument would be that this also, in fact, to let them go about like this is undermining the rule of law and the rights-based order, which at least the small Fennoscandian countries are highly dependent on in a world of realpolitik. So what's the answer? This is difficult. Yes, let's acknowledge that. But what's the answer? Well, the answer cannot be to let the industry define policy. And I say that because we do have some experience here. And I don't even have to talk about reindeer herding. Have a look at what happened to the ocean in the northernmost part of Arctic Norway. It used to be the richest ocean there was. Not anymore. The fjords are empty. The trawling fleet went about like no one else existed. And it put thousands of fishermen ashore, indigenous and non-indigenous. And then in these times of geopolitics is also energy. It's also about critical resources. Well, is there not a danger that states, perhaps especially the smaller states who are dependent on an international rights-based order, are literally speaking sawing off the branch upon they are sitting themselves? Because it's the same rights we are talking about. Do not get me wrong, I'm not comparing what is going on, say, in Ukraine with what's going on reindeer herding lands. But in principle, it's the same rights. So why not instruct the industry to do proper dialogue? If it is so that we really need all of this new energy, we really need all of these new resources, that should be very simple, I think. Now, of course, this brings me to my final point, namely that you know how it is. When something free, everyone wants it. And a problem has been that to develop our language, that's been free. No cost. Catch them. That's one thing. Another thing is that the achievements that we have made largely, as I said initially, through court practice in getting our indigenous rights recognized. Well, as long as those rights are free, then everyone wants them. Is it so that the second these rights that we have are starting to be perceived as costly to some, then we don't want them anymore? This is a challenge to rights-based order. This is a challenge to countries that otherwise claim themselves to be modern and modern democracies. We do have expectations from modern democracies, and we cannot see that all of them, to put it like this, is met when we see what's actually happening in the course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anders. Lisa, do you want to add on that?
Yes, I will try to be quick. Regarding specifically child welfare, I think, again, there's widespread non-compliance in practice with policies, laws, traditions that are meant to protect the rights of Indigenous children and families. And this lack of recognition in Quebec means that right now we have judges, lawyers, social workers, child protection workers that have not been trained, that don't even know that new laws or new rights exist and or are reaffirmed, and we need to respect them. And as a result, right now, there are many decisions in child welfare that fail to prioritize the child's cultural identity or the respect for Indigenous customary practices. And instead, the emphasis in practice remains on ensuring stability for Indigenous children, often by placing them in long-term foster care with non-Indigenous families. So that's what's happening right now. And despite the new laws that came in, last year, 17% of all Inuit children in Nunavik were followed by provincial child welfare services. So it's almost 1 out of 5 children, and 63% of them were placed in foster care. So obviously, removing children from their communities can create a sense of despair, and I think it undermines the efforts toward self-determination. And I think that affirming the right to self-determination in child welfare does not automatically address the underlying social conditions like poverty, food insecurity, housing issues. And we know that the disproportionate removal of children is closely tied to communities living in poverty. So this kind of creates a vicious cycle where children are removed from families due to poverty-related issues, and the funding to support those children is directed towards foster homes instead of their own families. So there are so many things that have to be changed in the way we are addressing those issues in the child welfare system. And as well, the colonial and the modern state practices have eroded traditional systems of self-regulations among Inuit and First Nations. And for decades, Indigenous legal traditions and values have been undermined by the imposition of those state laws. And it's difficult right now for some communities, not all of them, but for some of them to envision a system that aligns with their cultural values and ways of protecting children that is different from what they know of the child protection system that has been imposed. And this shift in redefining their governance and their social services can take some time, but community members want some change right now in the child welfare systems, and expectations for change are very high. So this is also one of the impacts of the issues that I raised before. And I was thinking when Bridget and Anders were speaking of the concept of legislative reconciliation, and I think that's important. I don't know if you heard about it. It was suggested by Naomi Metallic, which is a Mi'kmaq lawyer and associate professor of law, and this form of reconciliation recognizes Indigenous people's inherent jurisdiction over their own land and services and all their services without requiring them to prove their rights in court or negotiate agreements with the government. Like, it's recognition legislation. It could be about any kind of rights, generic rights, including cultural and linguistic rights, land rights, jurisdictional rights. And I think this would allow governments to legally bind themselves to the recognition of Indigenous jurisdiction without the need for lengthy litigation or detailed agreement or the use of courts all the time to recognize generic rights. So it came into my mind when I was hearing Bridget and Anders. I think we have to go towards legislative reconciliation in Canada and in the rest of the world.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I love that legislative reconciliation. I'll read about that. Sophie, do you want to finish up this question?
Sure, a lot have been said. Thank you, Bridget, Anders, and Lisa. So I'll be quite short. I'll just generally on relationship between self-determination and inequality or inequality. There's a wealth of research, in fact, like empirical research establishing the strong relationship that exists between increased self-determination for Indigenous peoples and economic well-being and equality within communities. I'm thinking about the Harvard Project, for instance, in the Kennedy School that has been conducting research for 30 years, empirical research within Indigenous communities in the United States, showing that those communities that exercise increase self-determination or the greater amount or intensity of self-determinations tend to be also more wealthy and more equitable than the communities with exercising less self-determinations. They also show, in fact, statistically that poverty rates is dropped very considerably following recognition of self-determination in those communities in comparison to population in general, which are quite interesting data. They also show that Indigenous communities that have increased exercise of self-determination tend to be more accountable to their members and tend to make decisions that are more aligned with community members' aspirations and needs than communities that are essentially implementing colonial government policies. So these are really interesting research. However, in Canada, as I mentioned, Canada tends to be reluctant to recognize Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination as well as to free, prior, and informed consent. It's true in family matters, like Lisa was very clear and eloquent on this. And it's also very true for land and resources. So Canada has been really reluctant, as well as provinces and territories, to give away or share their ultimate authority, their sovereignty over land use and resources, which creates power imbalances that impede the capacity of Indigenous communities to freely pursue their economic, social, cultural development, the exercise of self-determination, and to make sure that they do participate in economic development projects that truly benefits their communities and their members. So formal channels to benefit from economic development project, I'm thinking here especially of mining, I know better this sector, are somewhat limited. So we can think of in Nunavut, for instance, like royalties sharing exists, but it's quite limited. So in this context, as I mentioned earlier, Indigenous communities are more and more turning to what can be extraction contracting, right? Negotiating private agreements with mining companies that may result in increased benefits for communities. But research have shown that those benefits are not necessarily equitably distributed between communities. So these agreements are negotiated between closed doors, community by communities. They are confidential. So they are have and have-nots communities, depending on various factors, including the size of the community, it's the perception that the mining company will have of their capacity to trouble a project that and so on and so forth. But communities do not benefit equally from extraction contracting. And those benefits do not fall also equitably within the different members of the communities. So there's a wealth of literature on employment rates within mining that are where mining companies systematically, in many cases, do not attain the thresholds that is set, for instance, in the contracts. There's the boom and bust cycles also of those industries that contracts cannot prevent against. And there's also lots of research showing how these agreements and the inequitable distribution of wealth resulting from those ventures, including for women and other segments of the population, can result in community divisions that can be very problematic, leading to tensions and conflicts within communities, between communities, within families. There's also interesting research. I just want to mention that I'm thinking of recent research by Warren Bernauer, very interestingly show how extraction in the north, and his research are mainly taking place in Nunavut, shows that as in the past, the wealth disproportionately benefit other regions. So the wealth still travel out of where it is produced and do not benefit as expected local communities in terms of profits and rents, in terms of employment, in terms of boom and bust cycles, for instance, while at the same time it increases pressure on governments within those jurisdictions and on Indigenous governments to lessen environmental protection measures, to fast track environmental assessment procedures and so on, in order to try to keep those industries. So we're still in the same old colonial style relationship that have not changed with increased recognition for Indigenous peoples' rights and with extraction contracting. So I'll just close by saying that the realization of self-determination, in my view, and according to research that have been done, could lead to better distributive outcome for development projects on Indigenous people's lands, as long as they can exercise their inherent jurisdiction on their lands and are able to choose projects that fits their priorities and needs. Thank you.
Which type of changes or reforms are, in your view, necessary to foster Indigenous peoples' self-determination and reduce inequalities in the Arctic? And I know you all have so much interesting things to share, but if we could all stick to 3 minutes in your answers, it will allow us to have an exchange at the end. So, Anders, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. I was caught by the notion of legislative reconciliation, because a problem is that the times of assimilation, they live on through laws, and they keep up inequalities. I could give you one example. Not so long ago, reindeer herding rights in Norway, I believe it was similar in Sweden and Finland, was considered, directly translated, tolerated use, toltebruk in Norwegian. It meant that it could be regulated by law. Then in 1968, the Supreme Court of Norway, there were actually 2 rulings, concluded that Sami reindeer herders have rights, a rights base that predate state jurisdiction from times immemorial, right? So it means basically that our rights cannot be extinguished involuntarily by states. Now, it took 28 years before the Norwegian Ministry of Agriculture admitted that in writing. So that's one thing. But you see, when the legal baseline comes from another time, it's difficult. Paragraph 63 of the Reindeer Act in Sweden, for instance, it does really, well, there's no time to go in detail, but it does really uphold inequality for reindeer herders vis-a-vis farmers. And that, you see, originates from the time of establishment of farming, the colonization, if you will, of northern Norway, when Norway was a young national state. So to reduce inequalities, well, we might start with cleaning up the legal baseline, because there's a lot of this. And there have been theories, so-called research, that have been highly problematic, that has been the foundation of rulings in court, but it's still not, we really need to investigate that to see what could come from it. So that's at least one thing I'd like to bring about. I have 1,000 more things, but in the sake of time, let's leave it at that. By the way, we are also familiar with the work of Joe Colt at Harvard and his program. Very interesting indeed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Bridget, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you, Anders, again for sharing your history that's so similar to Canada's Indigenous peoples. And there's so many things out there that we have to contend with every day. And if anybody follows the the legal rights law blog or newsletter, you'll hear about every different court case from coast to coast to coast. And that's taking up a lot of our time, our energy, and our resources. When you talk about definitions, whose definition of poverty, right? Whose definition of reconciliation? And where are these terms coming from? And we have to make sure that they're just not buzz terms, or they're just, a process to be practiced under, a certain government. We need a lot of political will that these issues remain constant. And, reconciliation for us is about honoring our historic and numbered treaties, about honoring these colonial modern day treaties, the colonial self-government treaties, and allowing or respecting Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing, doing, and being. And what we want to talk about of stewardship and social responsibility. So, this means there's a lot of work. And if industry has full pockets, then they should be, sharing some of those resources. We, there's talk about the boom and bust cycles. And once again, is critical minerals going to be another boom and bust cycle? What are some of the local traditional economies that can ensure Indigenous peoples and community can continue to promote their lifeways? There's a lot of Indigenous industry out there, and a lot of the communities are going back to their subsistence ways, their traditional ways of use of the land and the food sources. We're impacted by now forest fires, and they're defined as, I don't know, land fires or wildfires. This is happening on our land. So anytime you try to define it the way you want to in a capitalist society, you're commodifying our resources, and you're commodifying the issue. So there again, we have to have conversations that are going to be based on respect and values, and that the Indigenous people's voices have to be heard. The Métis, the First Nations, and the Inuit that make the three territories a home, the circumpolar Indigenous people's voices have to be heard and respected. And we have to stop always having reconciliation from the courts, because the courts are also appointed by the political powers of the day. And just one other point, when we talk about community, it's the whole of community, but again, we section out our people from a colonial perspective. So the LGBTQ plus is now a real issue. When in community, if we talk about the health of our community, we're inclusive and holistic. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bridget, for those strong final words. Sophie, do you want to follow?
Sure. Just speaking of Canada, we need to have fundamental transformations of the relationship and their basis, as well as the constitutional and legal structures that underpins them. So it's not just small changes here and there. It's not talk about like state-led talk on reconciliation that will change things, but a very profound transformation of those relationships. And we can just think of the problematic assumption of Crown sovereignty over the land and assume the absolute title on the territory that has been confirmed again and again by the Supreme Court of Canada that do that do cat Indigenous people in a particular place within the Canadian legal and constitutional structure, which is quite problematic from the realization of the right to self-determination. And that puts on Indigenous peoples, and Bridget, I really like your words on that, and it's so true, that puts on Indigenous peoples all the work and the pain of having to go to court constantly and prove their right to Canada, instead of Canada trying to establish firmer basis for its sovereignty in Canada, which is simply assumed but have never been really justified in a satisfactory way. If I just look at mining, and I'd like to close with, again, the critical minerals. It's a hot topic with the energy transition, and some of my recent work, I've been analyzing and comparing the critical mineral policies at the federal and provincial levels, and trying to look at the discourses that are brought by those policies and the implications of those discourses for Indigenous people's rights, since most of critical mineral projects will take place within Indigenous people's homeland due to where those minerals are, and so on. And when you look at the federal critical mineral policies, it is repleted with discourses of Indigenous self-determination, free, prior, informed consent, all is there. But this is rhetoric. And it is rhetorical when you see provinces such as Alberta, Ontario, for instance, that are streamlining their process for approving critical minerals project. When you see other jurisdiction that speaks of accelerating processes to approve those projects that are to save the planet, finally, because they now are green project or presented as such in order to justify alleviating regulatory control over the approval of these projects, which is antinomic with the realization of self-determination and free and prior informed consent for Indigenous peoples. These discourses are also used by mining companies to try to safeguard the already problematic mining regimes in Canada that are based on the free and tree mining principles. So already those mining regimes, the constitutionality of which is now before courts in many jurisdictions in this country, now are promoted by the mining industry that wants to defend, and they even want to lessen the control. They even want to lessen the administrative, what they call red tape, to access lands to mine more, because they want to save the planet against climate change. So I think we need to be serious with talk of self-determination, for this not be only rhetoric. We really need to look at the structures that are in fact incompatible with the realization of those rights, and understand that the future of this country needs to be discussed on a nation-to-nation in a more equal basis, and not go ahead with our projects trying to justify them with such rhetoric. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Lisa, you have the final words for this final question.
Yeah, I will keep it very quick. to have a few minutes for questions. I think everything was said anyways. I think we have to keep, or maybe that is going to be the conclusion, that self-determination and governance rights are inherent. They are generic. They were there. They are still there. And they don't need to be constantly proven by laws or by courts that are outside of Indigenous traditional ways and regulating systems. And I think it's all about walking the talk, right? Honoring and respecting rights and existing treaties, Indigenous values and traditions, and also involving youth, families, elders, all community members in discussions about their futures and the development of, in child welfare, of prevention protection programs, but anything else that is impacting their everyday lives, such as land, resources, territories, etc. So I think that would be my final words very quickly.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you so much to our 4 panelists. I could truly have listened to you all day. If you haven't seen, there are also good words from Gérard, who had to leave in the chat, but we'll now open the floor for exchange. So if you have any questions or remarks, you can raise your hand and maybe specify to whom your question is addressed or if it's for everyone.
Can I make a comment, Laura?
Absolutely.
Okay, since it was a little bit silent for hand raising, I think we also have to recognize that, when institutions or academics are doing research, that they really speak and visit community, that, there's still so much armchair researching going on. There's researchers making recommendations for or on behalf of industry or for the Canadian government and probably other state interests. So we're very concerned about that. And we're also concerned that a lot of people out there calling themselves Arctic experts and Arctic researchers that do not live in the Arctic, that do not come to visit us for any length of time, and their recommendations are recognized and supported by the state, and we continue to be in the second place citizenship of the state. So, it's a note to everyone that we have to be very cognizant of what we're doing. When we say we're in relationship and in partnership, we have to know what those words mean. Because for us, when we we call somebody a friend, that's because that friend we have visited time and time and time again. We have shared food, stories. We've opened our homes to each other. We've welcomed them into community. So that matters to us. And when researchers disappear and we don't hear from them again, that really impacts how we want to open our doors again, how we want to welcome into community, and how we build research together. So, and until we really respect each other, only then will we be able to say our friends are our allies, and that we do need this relationship to influence the state for strong Indigenous public policy change. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for this very important comment and reminder. I don't know if anyone wants to add up to that. And I saw you opening your mic, yes?
Yes. If there are no questions, I might offer a final comment. So, but thank you, Bridget. Well spoken indeed. See, I don't think cleaning the legal baseline is enough, legislative reconciliation or whatnot. And why do I say that? Well, as I mentioned before, the courts aren't our courts. They're not based on our principles and our understanding of what legal behavior means. If you are familiar with the term tacit knowledge or tacit knowing by Michael Pugliani, this Pugliani, he had a brother who is less known, but his name was Carl Pugliani. He wrote a book, very interesting, a book of its time, but still, it's called The Great Transformation. He studied the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. And in this book, he makes a claim that in order for capitalism to work, one had to invent 3 fictitious commodities that did not exist per se in a market at that time. And what are those? Well, it's capital, it's paid labor, and to my point, most importantly, ownership to land. So if he's correct, and you know, we, from this sense, Reindehuds, we are very much, I could elaborate this forever, but we are very much, how to say, we might be termed a pre-capitalist society for this reason. As I said, we do not perceive that you really could own land. But if the whole system of the Western world today, not to speak of the entire world, is based on a fictitious commodity that was invented, ownership to land, no wonder then that we have some challenges in the court systems, because they are not our courts. Be that as it may, rights we have, again, but the question is not whether or not we have rights, it's only to what extent our rights are recognized and respected. So that is how I see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. We actually received a question in the chat. The question is there anything that gives you hope doing this challenging work? So I don't know if this question inspires anyone to answer.
The fact that Indigenous peoples are able to connect via Zoom and various other ways that, you know, we continue to offer each other hope, support each other. But, you know, in 2024, it's still a huge challenge because we've shared already, our rights are not being upheld or recognized. And until that serious work gets done, we'll still be having these conversations in several years to come.
Well, these discussions aren't going away anytime soon. That will be very sad because we'd all be out of work then, wouldn't we? But no, what gives me a bit of hope is, of course, once again, to meet with colleagues. Bridget, I know much from before, but also to hear Sophie and Lisa elaborate on this from their perspectives, that there is a real understanding. Not every scientist is obviously hopeless, and we are really grateful for the attention from national universities, institutes, and scientists to be sensitive to our problems. It's very needed. It's very important, and we can see that to a varying degree. Well, I'd say that our knowledge system is more recognized in the science world than in the world of public management. So that sort of gives me a bit of hope, and I think therefore also I'm very happy for this timely debate. I hope we can continue it. There is so much more to say. I made some notes. You know, I usually don't, but I have made many pages of notes here with ideas. And if anyone, by the way, could send me a reference to that legislative reconciliation work, I'd be very happy to receive it. But anyway, you know, just a final advice for this to go well, think about reindeer every day, all the time, and we will be fine. That will be excellent.
Salmon and caribou too. Moose, beaver, muskrats, water.
Thank you, everyone. We will think about all of those. Now I'm going to pass the floor to Gail for final words.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm along with Karen organizing the Wage Roundtable series here, and I really want to thank Bridget, Anders, Lisa, and Sophie for today's great thoughts, and Laura for chairing these, and Sophie for organizing a really interesting and informative roundtable. We've heard about the challenges to Indigenous self-determination and the perpetuation of inequalities. And these have included the continued imposition of state-determined structures that limit Indigenous power and the refusal to recognize Indigenous jurisdiction over lands and lives as underpinning the inequalities. There are differences across the circumpolar north, but it seems that a commonality is this situation of a lack of full recognition of Indigenous rights to lands and lives. And this whole thing is exacerbated by the assumptions of lack of Indigenous capacity and failure of adequate funding for Indigenous peoples to pursue their self-determination. I think we've been reminded of state and industry narratives about state security interests and majority interests and all the decisions and actions that can flow from these kinds of narratives. And we've been reminded of our dependence on colonial institutions of environmental assessment and things we really need to question solutions such as IBAs and things like that. And again, the issue of assimilatory laws and legal approaches came up. And at the heart of these issues is a lack of attention to and respect for, on the part of the state and industry and dominant populations, a lack of attention to and respect for Indigenous law, Indigenous cultural values, Indigenous perspectives, including on gender. Thank you for that, Bridget. Indigenous definitions of key concepts, and more broadly, a lack of attention to and respect for Indigenous knowledges, this deep Indigenous knowledges. And it seems like the base for addressing these is the need for honoring Indigenous concerns, honoring Indigenous definitions and Indigenous priorities. And as was brought up, making sure that these are honoring community perspectives and voices, and making sure that these are heard. I think we all were intrigued by the legislative reconciliation ideas. They're very embryonic and they're with their inadequacies. And at the end of, I think it was her third answer, Sophie summed up some of the recent research that underscores the perpetuation of inequalities and further emphasizes the need to deal with these. And I think these are critical issues for wage to pursue. And so we need to be looking at that and to ensure that we're attending to Indigenous views on all of these issues. So I'm really glad this roundtable was recorded. I think it'll be a roundtable that will be watched and referred to as much as none of us like to be recorded. And I want to thank everyone for participating, and especially the speakers and the chair.
Thanks, everyone, and stay tuned for more information about the next roundtable that will be coming at some point.